one of my favorite about it, right? Have you ever heard that one?
Yes, in fact, I have a friend with whom I got a deep part.
We're on the air.
Thank you. Good morning. It is Tuesday, January 31st, 2023. It's amazing. January's almost over. It's a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, and this is the first half of the morning. We are continuing our work on S5, also known as Affordable Heat Act, and taking a little bit of a detour to talk about IRA funding and Efficiency Vermont's role in S5, as well as energy burden with Ms. Lucci, who's on the screen, because we've used the term but not paused to spend time on the report. And also, before we get started, I wanted to take care of some, while we're on here, actually, some, I don't know what to call it, sort of meeting hygiene. So there, because we are also broadcasting remote, some people wonder, like, what are they hearing versus what are they not hearing? So we've been doing our best to be very clear about we're on the air, then we adjourn, we go off the air. But to help that draw a brighter line when we pause and go off the air, I'd like to ask that when I say we're adjourned, that we just not talk for long enough so that we actually go off the air, because sometimes people worry, like, what did they just say? And then we go off. So we take like a 15-second pause while the system unspools. And Senator White, I would ask when we are adjourned that you just open the door that way. That's another piece of it. And then the capacity of the room is now up to 17. So we go back and look at those heating and ventilating regulations or engineering data, and said actually this room would be higher. I think the reason the number was lower is because we were also trying to accommodate 6 feet of space back during the height of COVID. And that covers that. So we'll all figure this out and get a little better at doing this, starting and stopping the video. So with that, good morning, Mr. Riley. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. For the record, Daniel Riley, Senior Director of Government Affairs and Policy at Efficiency Vermont. I'm joined by my colleague, Kelly Lucci, the Director of Strategy and Partnerships. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so let me share my screen and there we go. Okay, my colleague Peter was in last week going over sort of the basics of who we are, the statewide, everywhere except for Burlington, energy efficiency utility. No need to recover this ground we were just in. I just want to sort of harken back to this slide that Peter covered last week, because it's going to be very relevant to the discussion of energy burden, to the discussion of the IRA bill, and again, to the discussion of S5 at the very end. These are really the core services we offer: supply chain engagement, education, promotion, guidance, rebates, customer support, and partnerships. That really is the core of what we do. And so just to keep this in mind as we're talking about, especially about the IRA bill and S5. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Kelly.
Hi, just a audio check. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for letting me testify remote today. I appreciate the opportunity to connect with everybody and give a little bit of a grounding in this topic. So many of you may be familiar with the 2019 Energy Burden Report that Efficiency Vermont released. I did want to note that we are currently in the process of putting together an update to that report. So what I intend to walk through with you all today is a review of some of the findings from 2019, and to give you as well a little bit of a sneak preview of some of what we're thinking about for the next iteration of the report, which we hope to be released within the next couple of months. So this.
Can I ask you a favor? The color codes are hard to read on our screen. Can you just read off from top to bottom what those quintiles are, or whatever they are?
Yep. Hang on one second, because I just need to move the windows around on my screen. I can make sure I can walk through those with you. So basically, the darkest orange is those would be communities that have the highest level of energy burden. moving towards dark blue where there's the lowest level of energy burden. And just for context, we have in the highest bucket anything over 17.4%. Is that enough grounding and context?
And we'll explain those percentages in just a minute.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Next slide, Dan. So understanding energy burden. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how energy burden helps us understand energy equity. And here's the formula we talked about. So energy burden is a pretty simple calculation. You look at energy spending, you divide it over household income, and you figure out what percent roughly is spent on energy for any given household. So when we did our energy burden report, we looked at the town level across the whole state. We had a formula we applied to give us a sense of what energy costs look like locally. I do want to note that we don't have, as you probably realize, we don't have consumption data on the thermal side. We have ways of modeling potential thermal costs. The only part of the state where we have hard set consumption data is in Vermont gas territory. And they were very kind in sharing some of their average data with us for our analysis. But the main point I really want to note here is energy burden households. We care about this metric because it overlaps with a lot of other metrics that speak to the issue of equity in energy usage. So not only would an energy burden household have more difficulty paying their energy bills, they also are likely to have challenges accessing the solutions that could help them reduce their long-term energy costs. Typically, as you know, upfront cost of something like a heat pump, something like an electric vehicle is likely to be out of reach if you are an energy burden household and you are already having challenges paying your bills on a regular basis. It's also important to note that there could be overlap in some cases with the folks who are likely to be feeling the greatest impacts of climate change today. So we care about this metric because as Efficiency Vermont and as other folks in the energy space, have told me after we released this data, it really gives us an opportunity to think about and better focus where we offer our programming, to think about moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So here's our rebate. If you access it, great. It really gives us the opportunity to think in a more multifaceted way about the barriers that are in place for Vermonters to taking steps to better manage and reduce their energy costs and be able to access the solutions that we want them to be able to access to address both their own costs and as we think collectively about how to address climate change.
We have a couple of questions. So one is, I just want to make sure I heard what goes into the energy spending. Did you say it's electricity plus heat plus transportation?
Yes. Yep. We look at electricity usage, for which we have very detailed consumption data, thanks to a great partnership with the electric distribution utilities in the state. We look at thermal usage. And we look at transportation usage based on some really helpful census data that we have access to, which helps us figure out sort of the average miles traveled at a community level across the state.
Great. And Senator Watson has a question.
That was my question actually, but I'm gonna, no, it's great. I'm gonna drill down a little bit deeper. How do you know things about the heat sector?
Yeah, so we have a formula that we put together, and I can actually send you sort of a detailed outline of our methodology after this, if it's helpful. But basically, the census has a lot of information around the mix of heating fuels used at a community level across the state. We also, as an energy program implementer, have a lot of baseline assumptions and survey data that we've used over time with our regulators to help structure our programs. So we take kind of our understanding of what a baseline house in Vermont would look like in terms of its usage, its relative efficiency to begin with. We layer that in with what we know to be the mix of heating fuels used in a given area, and then we're able to kind of come up for each community with what sort of the average home is likely to look like, and draw some assumptions about their annual heating costs as a result of that.
Okay, thank you.
I would just note, it is an inexact science, and that is gonna preview some of my remarks later.
Yes, great, thank you.
Yep, it is challenging, right? Like if as I said, in Vermont gas territory, we're able to access, data on exactly how much is being used, but that's not the case for the rest of the state. So we had a methodology that we applied, and a lot of outside reviewers who helped with that. We will be updating that methodology for our updated report, incidentally, because there's different data sources that we can access this time around.
One last question, the last sentence on that slide. They may also feel more significant impacts from the effects of climate change hitting Vermont today. Can you explain that one just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably any number of scenarios where that would be the case, but the most obvious one I would say is if you're living in a mobile or manufactured home, you probably have a relatively higher energy burden. Those homes do not tend to be very tight. And at the same time, given issues around siting of those homes, you may be more vulnerable, to flooding, to other issues. You may simply have a hard time, keeping your home cool enough in the summer to maintain health in your home as well. We're seeing the weather and the climate patterns shift enough in Vermont that cooling is becoming more of a necessity for folks. And so it's not just around keeping your home warm in the winter. We need to also be thinking about the effects of not having a tight or resilient home throughout the year.
Okay, thank you. Senator McCormick.
Thanks. I'm looking at the map and I'm not finding patterns. And I'm wondering if you could point out what you see in that map that you would like us to see.
Yeah, I can give you.
It looks like Chittenden County has the highest burden.
The lowest.
The lowest burden.
On that scale, okay.
Yep.
The orange, so you get to the bottom of the pile of bars there. The lower you go on that, the higher the.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
Even
So
so, what is the pattern that I'm supposed to see?
Yeah, so this is total energy burden. This is transportation, heating, and electricity. And I would say the broad pattern that we observe here is just what you discussed. When you look on a town level, you notice that energy burdens in Chittenden County and northwestern Vermont tend to be lower than they are, for example, in areas of the Northeast Kingdom. And I do want to note, the single biggest driver here of what we're seeing on the map is less around how much energy a household is using and more around the average incomes in these communities. It's an indication of, energy being an additionally challenging cost for folks who may have lower incomes to begin with. But that is the major pattern, right? We look at northwestern Vermont, we look at Chittenden County at a town level, and we see a relatively higher burden as we move out into communities of the state where, for example, they may be using less, they may be heating. They may have relatively lower heating costs because there's more prevalence of wood heat, but that still doesn't do enough to obviate, the basic challenge of income.
The other thing I notice is that there seems to be a kind of a band of mediocrity in the middle of the state. Living in Bethel, my eyes went to my own town at one point, just out of curiosity. And I see we are in the middle of pretty much a vertical, almost a top to bottom line in the central part of the state. That's all right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
So let's.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on.
Yep. You can go to the next.
Sorry, Kelly, did you want to respond to that question?
I did catch the last question, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, what is, you say you've explained the low burden in certain areas and the high burden in certain areas. And then there are not just towns, but a whole aggregation of towns with a similar kind of just hitting in the middle. What is that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just indicative that those communities are more in line with the average burden across the entire state. And that's probably a result of primarily the income levels in those communities, but also, an indication perhaps around, electricity and transportation costs as well. So it's not to say that we would ignore those communities by any means, but that doesn't, they don't kind of stand out on either end of the spectrum in the same way, sort of like you would expect to see kind of a normal distribution curve.
So if we can, I think I'd like to move on and come back.
Yeah.
We could spend more time on taking that map apart, but I want to make sure we get to see the
Yep.
forest before we spend too much time on trees.
So again, we're walking through the 2019 Energy Burden Report key findings. This is just a representation of, when we do that analysis of those three aspects of energy costs, transportation is actually the single largest driver, followed by thermal, with electricity as the third bucket, if you will. So transportation and thermal are definitely the areas where we are seeing higher costs, for Vermonters in terms of energy.
Which lines up nearly perfectly with the chart on the wall there of Vermont's GHG emissions, right? There's a near direct correlation.
And Dan, you can go to the next slide. Again, we don't have to dwell on this too long, but I did want to make sure I emphasize the point that energy burdened communities are not that way because they use more energy. When we break down the data, we actually see that a lot of our highest energy burden communities use slightly less than the average across the state. The highest, and certainly less than some of our higher spending communities. You don't see high spending being associated with a high energy burden, quite the contrary.
I know that you mentioned you're working on an update to the report. Will it incorporate, one, I guess, is when might we see that? And two, will it incorporate the impacts of the last two winters where we've seen a fuel price spike?
When we do the report, we will be looking over a multi-year period. So we won't just look at the most recent year. We'll probably take averages and average costs across then. But we haven't completed the analysis. So that's a great question. It may be that it makes sense for us to do kind of a portion that looks at just, the most recent energy costs and what those impacts are. Where we are at in terms of the report is we have done some initial analysis on transportation and electricity. We had the data we needed for that. We're still waiting because we changed our thermal methodology for a key data set that we leverage from the U.S. Department of Energy. Once we have that in hand, my hope is we'll probably take a month to complete the analysis and then send an initial draft out for review by a number of our external partners. So I'm hoping we have something by the end of the first quarter of this year, but it is a little bit dependent on a data set that isn't entirely in our control.
Thank you.
This is one last point I just wanted to make, right? So we talk about energy burden doesn't mean you're using more than others. It's income that tends to be the biggest driver. But I wanted to emphasize the point that it cuts in an additional way, which is that we have a system right now that's easier to participate in if you have money up front to begin with. And I just thought this data set was really interesting. We run surveys of customers on a pretty regular basis. And I just wanted to show like the difference between homeowners versus renters. And the folks who are most likely to have taken on an energy project in their home are the folks who own their home, not surprising. When you dig in though, and you think about what are the demographic, overlay with folks in Vermont who are renters, tend to be lower income, more likely to be people of color, more likely to be, new Americans, more likely to be younger, right? So if we are not able to look at the barriers that are in front of folks being able to access energy programs in a multifaceted way, if we only focus on the easy stuff, working with homeowners who have upfront capital to begin with, we're automatically building on top of a system that is already inequitable and inadvertently, making existing disparities worse. You can go to the next slide, Dan. So I wanted to just give a really quick sneak peek at the 2023 Energy Burden Report. As I mentioned, we have completed our initial analysis on the transportation side and on the electric side. This is a map, one of our first maps of electricity burden across the state. And you can see, again, if you look at a town level, the patterns are somewhat similar. But one thing I'm excited about that we're doing for 2023 is we're going to be digging in at a more granular level. So people do naturally want to look at things on a town level. They think, oh, it's my town. I want to know what the energy burden is. But what we recognized is that actually prevents us from painting a more detailed picture in more populous areas of the state, where if you zoom in, for example, on Winooski or Brattleboro or Montpelier, you actually get a much more nuanced and helpful picture of where you might want to focus efforts locally. So we'll be incorporating census block level data as well as town level data, and hopefully giving people the opportunity to explore this data set in a few different ways. And again, hopefully put it out there in a way that aids in programs beyond Efficiency Vermont being able to more effectively focus their resources and address barriers to participation. So Dan, you can go to the next slide. I'll leave you with this one. I just wanted to give you a peek. So an example of what it'll mean when we look at block level data. This is Rutland City. At a high level, this is a town that might have looked, slightly energy burdened, but you can see how much more detail you get when you're able to zoom in and look at a block level within that community. So on the left side here is our initial analysis of electric burden in Rutland, and on the right is our initial analysis of transportation burden in Rutland. And our intention is to produce, maps at this level of detail for a number of the more populous areas in Vermont, anywhere where there's effectively more than one census block per community. And just so folks are aware, census block, it represents about 2,000 or 3,000 people.
Did you say census blocks?
Yes, census block.
Are they not arbitrary and have little or no connection to electrical use?
I would say that the value of looking at census block is that there's a lot of other demographic factors that we can overlay with it, because it's a unit that is pretty widely used in statistics and sort of program design. So from our perspective, as we were thinking about assessing, for example, uptake of Efficiency Vermont programs, it becomes one of the easier units for us to track to, when, particularly with some programs, we don't have the opportunity to collect demographic data every time a customer participates. In some cases, asking questions like that can just present an additional barrier that we don't want to put in front of people. But I don't think that census block is any more or less arbitrary, for example, than town level, right? That somebody in the town next door to me might use about the same as I do. It's just a different way to slice and dice the data, and this happens to be a little bit more granular.
So they're equally as arbitrary.
Correct. One is just more detailed.
Mr. Chair, I would submit that if you were to have a map that showed how far apart homes and customers were from one another, and we're able to make a map that showed those that were more than 10 miles, 10 houses per mile or 2 houses per mile, you would have a map that had a very tight correspondence to energy usage and to income equity.
I don't know if you were going to get to this, so feel free to say, hold your horses. But you have a statewide mandate, and you need to deliver basically sort of equivalent service to everyone. On the other hand, this kind of data suggests, that you would target the most burdened populations in order to make the program more helpful. Can you say something about how you balance off that requirement deliver service everywhere, but also be responsive to the hotspots that you see? Hotspots.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's a balance that we have to consider with every program that we design and implement. Really, as I look at it, the scale of the transformation that's needed in our energy system means we can't risk leaving anybody behind. And so if we don't have a good picture of what unique barriers all of the different customer groups we seek to serve in Vermont are facing, then we really risk, in a one-size-fits-all approach, simply serving the people who it's already easy to serve. You could make an argument for that, that in some ways that type of program would be cheaper to run. And that is certain cost is certainly a consideration we always need to take into account. But I think everybody pays and everybody should have an opportunity to participate and benefit from the programs. And so, thinking of data like this, digging in, understanding the different customers we seek to serve, and finding ways to reach those who maybe have not had an opportunity to participate in the past doesn't exclude anybody else from participating. It simply pushes us to do our jobs better, which I'm always an advocate for.
Are you, under your guidelines for operation, allowed to use equity as your driver for that decision making as opposed to equal?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So Efficiency Vermont has a broad set of energy savings goals called quantifiable performance indicators that we have to hit every performance period. We also have a set of what are called minimum performance requirements that are intended to push us, I think, in the direction of program equity. Things like amount of spending in service to low-income customers, or number of small businesses that we need to serve in a given performance period, versus just being able to focus on the largest energy users in the state. So I think there are a number of ways in which our regulators have sought over time to embed equity into the work that we do. As we move into the process with the Public Utility Commission and the Public Service Department about thinking about what our services might look like in 2024 through 2026, we have asked them to step back with us and think in a more comprehensive way about how Efficiency Vermont might be able to serve equity, and think about how our mandate has changed over time, and how we can best help the state meet its climate and equity goals broadly. So I would say there's nothing in there that says explicitly you can and should think about equity, but there are an awful lot of ways in which our regulators, I think, have been very thoughtful and intentional in trying to pull us in the direction of not simply focusing on the cheapest energy savings available. If we only looked at that, we would primarily have large C&I focused programs, large commercial and industrial focused programs, and work primarily with the largest businesses. But again, everybody pays, so everybody should have an opportunity to benefit. And we really do strive to create a path for everybody.
Thank you. I've been asking questions, so I might have to curb my own enthusiasm, but I'm just looking at the clock. We're about half an hour, about half the time. So in terms of pacing.
This is the last slide that I have. I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
I just want to say, any other sort of energy burden questions for Kelly before I dive into Inflation Reduction Act?
Senator McDonald.
What we're seeing makes sense because it's reporting what exists in areas that are picked for their arbitrariness. What are the conditions which lend themselves to more expensive electric power or use of transportation power sources?
I apologize, Senator. I didn't catch the last part of your question. Would you mind repeating that?
Excuse me?
I did catch the last part of your question. I heard, what are the conditions? And then I lost you.
What are
Could
the
you repeat?
conditions which result in inequitable power costs? What are the equitable commuting and automobile transportation? Not automobile, but transportation costs.
So when we burden,
We may have lost Kelly momentarily. I mean, so much of it, Senator, is related to income and percentage of income that you spend on gasoline and percentage of your income that your electric bill is. I mean, that is really the core of those conditions.
Well, yeah, I think that's, of course, we're looking to find out who spends more on gasoline and what are the conditions which will prophesize where those people spend more money for gasoline than electricity.
Go ahead.
She's frozen.
Did you guys lose me for a second? Are you hearing me? Can you all hear me?
No,
Yeah, now we can hear you.
We lost you for several minutes.
Okay, I apologize. Yeah, that was bizarre. The Zoom automatically sent me back in. I'm not sure what happened. So I would say Senator McDonald, I'm happy to send more to take time away from Dan because I know he's got a lot of slides and it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. So I'm a little concerned I might only give you a half explanation. But I will confer with Dan and I will be sure to follow up and give you some more detailed information on this question.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mr. Chair, I'm guilty once again of asking a question I think I know the answer to.
Oh, that's a
And
foul.
but my feathers get ruffled when we have answers to questions that we get to through circuitous routes. If houses aren't close to
Angle you're interested in. So I think it's just easier to say what your hypothesis is and ask someone to respond. Otherwise, it's a bit of a fishing expedition and clearly they frustrate you.
Well,
So unintentionally.
Mr. Chair, I've written that co-ops only went where investor-owned utilities refused to go because they were not profitable. The places where electricity sales are not profitable tends to be where poorer people live. They live there because the houses are far apart and electricity's more expensive. And we don't get to that by starting right out with that. We kind of back into it through census blocks, which don't have a doggone thing to do with why electricity is more expensive. It's just that's where they started. Where you have co-ops, you have more expensive electricity. Where you have co-ops, you have an eagerness to participate in efficiency Vermont types of activities. Where you have investor-owned utilities, we have a history of those utilities refusing, avoiding, dragging their feet, and not interested in efficiency projects. When we are told that we have these the wiring system up and down the middle of the state only passed by one vote, we're not told that the people who lobbied against that system were the investor-owned utilities.
So we're gonna have the utilities in next week, so I'm gonna capture your question and well, actually, I'd like you to write to them as well, but with that, we'll ask them, next week when they're in. With that, Mr. Riley, I know you have.
Yes,
IRA.
I am going to cover $370 billion and 1,500 pages of federal bill text in about 15 minutes. So I am going to talk quite quickly. I want to be clear sort of for this part. I have spent a long time studying the map, i.e. the text of this bill and sort of thinking and analyzing that. I'm not here today to predict the journey. And then that's really for two reasons. Number one, there is still quite a bit we don't know regarding specific guidance from the Department of Energy and from the Environmental Protection Agency, right? In terms of under the budget reconciliation process, you have billions of dollars of funding allocated to a relatively small amount of text with sort of more rules and guidance that are going to be critical that I'm going to talk about. That is,
We know when we'll get that guidance.
yes, and I will touch on some of those specific programs going forward. The other part of the reason is that because of the way this law is written, the state energy office, in this case, the Department of Public Service, is the state entity designated to receive most of these funds, and they would need to be the entity that applies for the competitive grants. And so I certainly do not want to speak for them. A lot of these decisions will be at their discretion in terms of they will be the ones submitting the application to the Department of Energy. So I certainly don't want to get ahead of them in terms of how these funds are going to be allocated or anything of that nature. I'm just sort of here to give a quick overview of what's in the bill specifically as it relates to electrification and weatherization. There's a lot in here on solar, there's a lot in here on a lot, environmental justice, climate mitigation, things like that we could be here for hours and hours. And so I'm really just going to kind of drill down into the parts that are relevant to the discussion on S5 and how they could possibly interact.
Well, and just so you don't feel like you have to cover everything, Joyce Manchester from JFO is also going to take a bite at the same apple.
Yeah.
And we'll learn more with each iteration.
Gotcha. But really, I want to start my remarks by saying we feel strongly here. The goal should be to build systems that will endure long after these one-time funds run out. This is an incredible opportunity. There was quite a series of events that brought this all together. Vermont is very good at building these enduring systems in the clean energy space, whether it's the EEU model, whether it's Tier 3 of the RES. But again, the goal here should not be to push funds through as quickly as possible, to stand up a workforce, through incentives that's not going to be able to be sustained. It's really thinking about the day after, I think is the charge here. So with that, very quickly, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a $733 billion bill total, focused on healthcare, taxes, and climate. It passed on September 13th, 2022. There is $369 billion in climate and clean energy investments. It really is the most significant climate bill in our history. It is a mix of grants, loans, and tax incentives. And again, that's why it's fantastic that JFO is coming in, and so they can speak to sort of the bigger mix and how that's going to interact with the state fiscal system. But just to flag that there are a lot of different vehicles, and I'm going to touch on a few of them shortly. I want to just kind of offer a few initial considerations as you think about these funds. The first is that these funds have a 10-year timeline. The state of Vermont will receive about $59 million in consumer home energy rebate programs. The funds, the rebate funds have to be spent by September 30th, 2031. Because Congress never makes things easy, the tax breaks are eligible through September 30th, 2032. So there are, that last bullet, there are some notable exceptions. Again, please read the fine print. Most of the funds have a 10-year time frame. Some of them are much shorter. And so, 10 years seems like a long amount of time, but we know in this work that it goes very, very quickly. As I mentioned, the rebate programs will flow through state energy offices. The way that's going to work is the Department of Energy is going to send the Department of Public Service a block grant for these programs. That's based on a formula, largely based on population. And so that's how we know that of the $9 billion that the federal government has put aside in this bill, Vermont's going to receive about $59 million. The exact timing is still a little bit TBD. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. I want to flag, a lot of these programs are designed for low to moderate income. Right. And just to note that for the Inflation Reduction Act, low to moderate income is defined as up to 150% of AMI. That is different than the definition under the ARPA bill. So there is going to have to be some harmonizing those two things. The other key date here, plans must be submitted by August 15th, 2024, or you lose access to the funds. The way the bill is written around accessing these rebate funds, every state has to have a plan submitted by August 15th, 2024. We expect Vermont will submit a plan. Again, I don't want to speak for them, but if they do not, whatever states do not, the pie is divided up. So that 59 million figure could increase. If 45 states submit a plan, the pie will be divided 45 ways. That 59 million is based on all 50 states submitting a plan.
Question on the AMI.
Yes.
Do you know the granularity of that calculation? Statewide, countywide, census.
I don't have offhand, but I could check. and get back to you on that. There are quite a bit of climate justice funding opportunities that I'll talk about. There is the Justice 40 provision in this bill that 40% of the funds go to low to moderate income and underserved communities. There's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which I will touch on in a minute, and that to say there's more coming from the EPA regarding some of the climate justice funding opportunities that could have an impact on thermal spending here in Vermont. I want to touch briefly on the tax credits because these are the ones that have already gone into effect, right? These residential energy and construction energy efficiency tax credits, these have launched on January 1st. These are the things, there is no cap. Every single Vermonter can apply for them, every single Vermonter with tax liability, I should note. That is, these are available for 11 years, and these are stackable. That again, you can apply for this $200 incentive for a heat pump, and you can stack that on top of the rebate funding that's going to come in the grant, and you can stack that with the current existing Efficiency Vermont rebate, right? So these ones are all additive. $600 for an electric panel, $1,200 for a weatherization project, $200 for a heat pump.
Are these incentives, these are waivers of tax liability? Right?
Tax credits, right? Like additional tax credits you can apply.
And are they refundable or so that if you don't have the income to offset, the tax liability to offset?
You must have tax liability. That is one of the issues that IRS is still working on. And sort of how do you reach those 60 million Americans that do not pay any taxes? Okay, thank you. Yeah. That's the residential one. On the construction one, again, I want to stress, I am not a tax accountant. Please call anyone watching at home, contact a licensed tax professional. I'm simply stating what is in the bill. This one has also gone into effect. This is an enhanced construction energy efficiency credit up to $1.88 per square foot for new construction or for existing building renovations. There is some limited retroactivity with new construction projects that started in 2022. Again, call your accountant. I am not here to offer specific guidance. And then there are stretch goals here too. If you reach that Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Home standard of efficiency, you can get even bigger savings. Just to put, just to set the stage in terms of there are existing tax credits that you can apply for right now related to this work.
The Zero Energy Ready Home a new classification, or is this existing?
It is existing. It's relatively new, but it does exist. Those are the tax credits. I want to drill down on the rebate programs. This is, we know every state that apply gets a check. The first one is the Home Energy Performance-Based Whole House Rebates, the HOMES program. This was the our own Congressman Peter Welch was a longtime champion of this and helped advocate for this throughout the entire process. So these are really, homes are your core energy efficiency upgrades, right? This is air sealing, insulation, weatherization. Vermont will receive $29.4 million. Of that, the State Energy Office can use up to 20% of these funds for planning, administration, and technical assistance. You asked about when we are going to know, so some more of the specifics. The Department of Energy has put out a request for information, just, hey, out to the country, how should we implement these programs? That is due on March 2nd. And so once they have that information, we expect the guidance to be forthcoming probably in Q3 or Q4 of this year, and those funds to start flowing. The second big part of this is the High Efficiency Electric Homes and Rebates Act, HERA. That is more your electrification rebates, things like heat pump water heaters, electric stoves, electric appliances. Again, it's a similar amount of money, 29.2 million, sort of same terms and conditions apply in terms of what the State Energy Office can use the funding for. They issued the RFI at the same time. So again, we are expecting that to start flowing in Q3 or Q4 of this year. That is just my best guess. It's entirely up to the Department of Energy. I want to flag the HOPE, the Home Energy Efficiency Contractor Training Grants. There is $200 million nationally in the bill to help train the workforce. I don't have details yet about how that's exactly going to play out in Vermont, but we know, heat pump could be free, but if there's no one to put it in your home, it's not a lot of it. It's going to be so that the contractor training, those are all online trainings and certifications. That is a really critical part of this.
Do you know if any of these include sort of a small state minimum?
Yeah, there is no small state. These funds are purely the formula for all 50 states, largely based on that. Next, I just want to cover briefly on the climate justice funding opportunities. These are programs that are in the bill that are run more through the Environmental Protection Agency. We know a little bit less about these programs than we do the Department of Energy home energy rebates. The first is this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, aka the GREEN Bank. This is to enable low-income and disadvantaged communities to deploy or benefit from zero emissions technologies. It is $20 billion for financial and technical assistance. That is sort of the green bank, right? Like trying to set up a national green bank. There's still a lot we don't know about the exact shape, if that's going to be a national entity, if that's going to be a couple regional entities, if that's going to be on the state level. There are a lot of very smart folks in Vermont that are already moving on this, that are already thinking and working, but this is an example of something where we just don't have a lot of details yet how that's going to work. There are $7 billion for grants to low to moderate income and disadvantaged communities. That is something that could potentially be targeted for some of the energy burden work, some of the thermal work that we're doing. Again, the fine print, we are expecting more details on that to be released by the 12th of February. And these funds must be awarded by September of 24. Again, it's good that JFO is coming in. There's a lot here. I know I'm covering quite a bit of ground. The $5 billion in climate pollution reduction grants, these are for states to develop GHG reduction plans. It's $250 million for developing these plans, and then $4.75 billion for grants to help implement them. There is no formula allocation yet that we know of in terms of we know that X state is going to get Y. We're still waiting on that. Those funds have to be out by September of 2026. The last one, the environmental and climate justice block grants, there are $3 billion nationally for that. That's really, it's an emphasis on community-led programs. It explicitly calls out partnerships with community-based nonprofits. The block grant one is really focused on climate resilience, excuse me. That's your programs set up heating centers, cooling centers, more resilient infrastructure. That's a little bit less relevant to the S5 conversation that we're. To drill just a little bit deeper down on the two rebate programs that will have the most direct relevance to S5. The first is this HERO program, the High Efficiency Electric Homes and Rebates Act. I want to stress that again, for your electrification rebates, for your heat pump, for your electric stoves, these rebates are only available for LMI as defined by up to 150% of area median, right? So we know Vermont's going to get 29 million for this. We know that it's only for those making up to 150%. There is a total maximum allowable rebate of $14,000. That is a significant amount of money to help someone electrify their home, up to $8,000 for a heat pump. There are some considerations into that, which I will get into in a minute, but again, to say that, that is a significant amount of money. This last bullet, rebates cannot be combined with rebates from other federal grant programs. I want to hedge a little bit there. That is in the bill text, right? That you can't combine the homes weatherization with the HERO, that you can't combine these two and take one rebate from them. There is some gray area that's still being worked out in terms of how you define one project, how these interact. So there may be a little give, but I did want to flag that you can claim your tax credit for your heat pump and you can claim your HERO rebate for it, but you may be able to combine it together. I did just want to mention that. Again, the homes program, the very similar in terms of these are your air sealing, your weatherization, your insulation. Again, about 29 million for Vermont. There's a lot of text on this slide, I know. Rebates for energy, this middle bullet around measured versus modeled savings. If a project achieves modeled energy savings of greater than 35%, that remains an open question, right? Do you use sort of computer programs to model energy savings based on a street, based on a census tract, based on something like that? Or do you have to go into a home and measure, right? A before or after. And there are policy considerations for both of those. That is a prime example of something that still needs to be worked out. And that sort of perfectly sets up my next slide on these are really the key policy considerations as I see them. Again, I'm just here to raise the questions. I'm not here to provide all the answers. I want to be very clear. Kelly mentioned sort of unregulated fuels, and Senator Watson, you had asked about how we measure fuel savings, especially in a non-VGS customer in a delivered fuel. That is very different. How do you measure that in Vermont, right? especially if the law states in order to achieve this rebate, you must achieve a certain percentage of energy savings. How can you do that? And it sort of, it speaks to the challenge at the Department of Energy and at the challenge of the State Energy Office in terms of how do you integrate national guidelines from DOE with state level flexibility, right? In terms of, Vermont customers are largely, rural delivered fuels versus a larger urban state serviced by a natural gas utility. So that is a key part to get right. I think integration with existing programs, right? What do all these new rebates mean for tier 3? What does all of this mean for the EU model? And again, where does S5 play into all of that? The complexity of income verification, right? So all those year rebates, you have to qualify. You have to be up to 150%. How do you strike the balance between preventing fraud, but making it easier for everyone to access? You don't want a situation where you'd have to bring your W-2 to Home Depot to be able to access, right? And so how do you make the system easy enough for all Vermonters to accept, to use while ensuring the integrity of it? And again, the last part, which you hear everywhere about every issue, workforce and supply chain issues, right? Are there enough workers in the state to perform this work? And how do we prepare knowing all of this money is going to flow into all 50 states at the same time in terms of supply chain and preparing for that? So those are the key questions. It's not as simple as here's a check, go out and do whatever you want.
Wait a weekend after you come back in and answer all these questions.
Yes. That's sort of the quick IRA overview. Before I pivot, I just wanted any time for other questions, follow up.
Nope, that's good. Let's press on.
Okay. I want to talk very quickly on the Affordable Heat Act. I'll be very brief. Just a few key points here. The first is Efficiency Vermont is supportive of the broad goals behind efforts to create a clean heat standard, however we want to call it. It has the potential really to provide societal and customer benefits. We as an organization support reducing energy burdens, saving money, reducing greenhouse gases. We're big fans of all of those things. So we are supportive of a larger effort. Again, a point that we really want to stress, weatherization and fuel switching, that does create the greatest societal and customer benefits. You heard Peter on Friday talking about this Clean Heat Homes program, the full suite of services. That is really what's most needed in terms of sealing up the home, electrifying it. That is critically important. Again, as a reminder, Efficiency Vermont is regulated by the PUC. They have already weighed in on this matter with the Act 62 report. I don't need to read that. You are familiar. I just wanted to put that reminder up. They have already come up with that plan. And finally, just a couple key sort of policy considerations that as we see them. I think, first and foremost, if Efficiency Vermont was given a role to play with this bill, of course, we would need this legislation to align with our existing regulatory construct, right? So I want to be very clear that we would not want to get ahead of any PUC proceedings on this topic. And that's sort of, number one, in terms of how would the default delivery agent system interact with the existing EU structure? How does it sort of overlap with tier 3 eligible measures, with, sort of our existing technical advisory group characterizations, making sure that this new credit allocation and sale doesn't interact in any negative ways. And again, nobody wants to double count, right? And so that's a key part of this. How can the default delivery agent track which fuel dealers are in and which one out? Again, there have to, as in every issue, there have to be sort of budget and revenue considerations here around how that functions. The default delivery agent, as we understand it can't function like a light switch, right? As I read the bill, if the market is working, a default delivery agent is not needed. But it's not something that you can just turn right on and off, right? There is quite a bit that goes into that in terms of education, in terms of communication, in terms of really customizing those incentives, in terms of building that network to sort of keep track of all the participants of the system. And so that's a really, really big part of it. And again, that goes to sort of to 3, how do you implement this quickly and cost effectively? Who measures the results and how, and sort of how do you define low-income measures that can be funded by non-compliance payments. So that's sort of the theme of my remarks today. More questions than answers. And with that, let me stop there.
Well, it's great to have questions, and I think it'll be helpful for us to pause and really think them through to the extent that we need to look at S5 and say we need to build in flexibility, or we might be able to answer some questions in the bill itself, or we might need to think about leaving something open so that that can be addressed in the PUC proceeding, for instance. So, White.
Thank you, Chairman Bright. So you're familiar with tag groups in general. And one of the concerns that we've had raised from our constituents, and I'm just looking for your experience with these groups, a concern that has been flagged by constituents is that there isn't a lay person that's being contemplated on the tag group, that the idea of having experts and not someone who maybe has lived experience will be problematic. And for me, I don't necessarily agree with that characterization, because I do think a technical advisory group has a very specific purpose. I'm wondering if Efficiency Vermont has thought about that as well in your own technical work, and how you feel about the idea of having a layperson on one of these.
Sure, no, it's a great question. And Kelly, I don't know if you're still with us, if your internet is back on. You know, I know in your partnership role, you've sort of wrestled with this many times. I wonder if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we have operated tags in Vermont. We've operated them in other areas of the country, and there's not like a set template that you have to follow. It's really the structure of the tag can follow the policy outcomes that you're seeking. So I don't think it would cause a challenge to open up the tag to different membership. The discussions tend to be very technically focused, and you know, it tends to be very important to make sure you have expertise to really dig in on measures, on usage profiles, and really ensure that focus is being met. But there are absolutely different models, you know, that you can follow to open the process up a little bit.
So Senator White makes me think that I think what the bill provides for now is the tag has access to the equity group or anyone they want to consult with. I'm not sure if the equity group, though, has the same ability to initiate a conversation with the tag.
That might be.
We might want to ensure that the equity group has the opportunity to speak up, and in case they're not sort of called on by the tag.
I think that would be a really fair compromise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else for Mr. Riley and Ms. Lucci? Senator?
Thank you, Chairman Bright. So Tier 3 and this Affordable Heat Act proposal, do you have any suggestions on how we would overlap those programs in a way that would not complicate it for our utilities and would also not double count? Do you have suggestions on that, or have you contemplated the legislation around it?
It's a great question. I think just sort of the complicated interactive nature of Efficiency Vermont, I'm not prepared to do that at this point, but it certainly is something that we could do a little bit more homework,
Okay.
both internally and both with our utility partners to come back with more sort of concrete recommendations around that. But I don't want to speak out of school.
Totally.
Great. Well, despite the fact we have a lot of data and a lot of questions, we're finishing exactly on time. So thank you very much for the visit, and we won't be shy. We'll follow up with more questions.
And to say that I'm always happy to come back, especially as some of this more guidance is known on the IRA bill over, it is going to be over the next couple of months. So I'm happy to revisit this presentation and sort of know what we know more as we reach the end of the session.
Thanks so much. And with that, we are going to go to speaking with Corey Ann Wind, the Oregon Clean Fuels Program Manager. Ms. Wind, good morning. I know it's 3 hours earlier for you there, so it really is morning. So thanks for joining us and coming back. You spoke with us last year about we have new members of the committee, and as you may know, we're very interested in what Oregon's doing because you have a clean fuels program for a performance standard for transportation fuels, and we're standing up a performance standard for heating fuels. So if you could introduce us to your program and then be kind enough to help us see, what are the lessons learned that we should be thinking about as we construct this program?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay, do you have my slides or am I screen sharing?
Just a moment.
She can screen share, she's co-host.
Okay, yeah, you can screen share. You're set for that, I believe.
Okay. Do you see some slides?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, let me get oriented. It changed screens on me. Of course, it's going to do this. So anyway, I'll just keep on going. So good morning, everybody. My name is Corey Ann Wind, and I am the program manager for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. I've been with the state of Oregon for the Department of Environmental Quality for 29 years now, doing all kinds of air quality and climate related programs. And I've been working on this Clean Fuels Program for about 13 years now, started back in 2010 with developing the program. And so I'm going to just kind of provide for you kind of a brief overview of where we are today and some basic kind of concepts of our Clean Fuels Program. And I'll try to, make the connections to like what you're trying to do with the clean heat standard as I understand it.
Great, thank you.
So let's see. I'll do that. Okay, so in a nutshell, what a Clean Fuels Program does, and again, yes, for the clarification, it is for transportation fuels. So the goal of the program in Oregon is to lower greenhouse gas emissions from Oregon's transportation fuels. The measure that we use for this is it's life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just what comes out of the tailpipe. It's actually from how the transportation fuel is produced and refined and transported and combusted in a vehicle. So we do account for all of those emissions. And so generally speaking, our program began implementation in 2016. So our baseline year was 2015. And so between 2016, starting in 2016, every year we just increase the reductions that are required. So in year one, it was like 0.25%. Year two, it's 0.5%. We're in year 8 of the program right now, and we're at 6.5% reductions that are required. So we are making progress. Ultimately, we have rules in the books right now out to 2035, and I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation. We've expanded our program. So we actually have targets set out to 2035 now, and that is 37% reductions in those life cycle emissions from our 2015 baseline. And so the way that it is that the fuel providers of gasoline, diesel, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel must participate. And participate means they need to register with us, they need to report to us, and they need to comply with the standards. And what the standards are is that, like here on this chart, if you have a fuel that has a carbon score that falls underneath what that compliance line is, then they are lower carbon and they are good because they have reductions in greenhouse gases. So they generate credits. And if you have fuels that are over the line, so higher carbon than what the standard is, you generate deficits. So at the end of the year, you have, and each of the credits and deficits are a ton of greenhouse gases. So at the end of the year, you count up all of your deficits and all of your credits, and you have to have at least the same number of credits and you retire them in, to offset your deficits. And so the higher carbon fuels right now are fossil gas and diesel, and everything else is lower. So the biofuels, ethanols, biodiesels, renewable diesels, as well as renewable natural gas, propane, Electricity in Oregon is a lower carbon fuel, hydrogen, and we also have sustainable aviation fuel. So those are all scores that lie underneath the curve. So basically, it's the entities, the parties that have the higher carbon fuels, they have to get credits. So they can generate them themselves if they're invested in charging infrastructure or some kind of renewable natural gas projects. They can trade them. So like if an oil company is buying biofuels from a biofuel company, the biofuel company has the credits, but if they're buying the fuel, they can trade those credits along with that fuel. Or we also support a market where you can go and just purchase credits from another entity, like an EV charger service provider, something like that. So, so that's kind of just the general mechanics of how that works.
That credit market, have you always found that there are enough credits available so that someone who's operating a deficit can acquire what they need, zero out?
Yes, actually, yes. So even starting in the beginning of the first year, there have always been an excess of credits for the number of deficits that are generated. So we do, credits can be banked for future use. So whatever extra credits get generated, you roll it over to the future years.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what this next slide is really trying to demonstrate for you is that because we're talking about life cycle emissions from the transportation fuels, there are a lot of different kinds. Like every single producer has a different way, a different feedstock of which they make it from, or maybe it's like a biodiesel refinery, but sometimes there's coal that, you know, coal-fired electricity that's used for it versus natural gas versus biomass. So there's basically every producer, and it's not even in just US. I mean, it's an international, you know, commodity, transportation fuels. So what the producers of these fuels do is like submit to Oregon an application. Basically, it's a big inputs of a model. It's called the GREET model, GREET. It's a model that was developed by the Argonne National Laboratory, and it is the accepted model that we use to calculate emissions from those transportation fuels. So those producers submit it to us, DEQ, we go through the model, we verify the inputs, and then we get an output for a carbon score. And it's that carbon score that is used to determine whether it's higher or lower than the actual standard for that year, which then ultimately determines how many credits that are generated from supplying those fuels. So what this here is, you can see kind of like it, in order, it's, you know, it's biodiesel, it's CNG, electricity, ethanol, and each of those dots represents a producer that has gotten approval for their fuel to be used in the Clean Fuels program. So as of I think we just updated this list last week, actually. We have approved about 190 different pathways or these carbon scores for use in Oregon. And so, and we continuously work with the producers to verify what those scores are. And we have an annual process where, you know, maybe a biofuel producer has, you know, gotten approval for a carbon intensity score. And then, but a year later, they have more data. So they submit the data to us so that we can make sure that they're still living within the confines of that approval. You know, if it's lower, great. And we adjust that number down so they can generate more credits. If it's higher, we also make them make up that difference, right? Because then in theory, well, not even in theory, they generated more credits than they should have. And so they need to replace those illegitimately generated credits with more credits to make the program whole. So we have that process. And in 2022 as well, was the first year that we actually, for the largest of the fuel providers, required that they hire a third party to actually verify their pathways. So we have that much more assurance that what their emissions are is accurate.
Great. Can you just briefly, I'm seeing, for instance, with electricity, there's actually negative carbon intensity values. How does a fuel or an energy source earn a negative carbon intensity value?
Yeah, excellent question. So what happens, so in the case of like you see some negatives for the compressed natural gas and electricity, So what those pathways are, if you have like manures, so animal manures with swine, dairy cows, those kinds of things. And if that manure is being put into a digester and the methane is being extracted, and whether that methane is being used directly in a compressed or liquefied form, or if it's going into a generator to then produce renewable electricity, that's kind of the pathway. And the reason why it's negative is because that manure would have otherwise been just land applied, and all of that methane would have been fugitively emitted, just off-gassed. And so by the process of collecting it, processing it, and then using it in an engine is where you get that avoided methane emissions.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go on. So this program has been been implemented since 2016. So we're in year 8 now. Over the first 7 years of the program, it has been really successful in the state of Oregon as a strategy to reduce emissions. We've reduced almost 8 million tons of greenhouse gases for the fuels that are used in Oregon. And again, it's 8 million, it's life cycle emissions. So it's not only what is emitted in Oregon, but there are some upstream reductions as well. And that roughly displaces about 2 billion gallons of fossil fuels. So otherwise fossil gas and fossil diesel being replaced by biofuels or other alternative fuels. The carbon intensity of the ethanol and biodiesel, right? Like a lot of people say, well, you know, it's not like the biofuels are going to get any cleaner. It actually has over the 7 years of the program, that those emissions from even those basic, you know, biofuels have been reduced by about 20%. So they are getting cleaner and cleaner. And those producers just are continuously working to like make those processes more efficient. In addition, Oregon has mandates to use 10% ethanol in gasoline and 5% biodiesel in diesel. And over the first 7 years of the program, especially the gasoline, the ethanol remains just about the same at 10%. But on the biodiesel side, we've seen really big increases in biodiesel and renewable diesel. And there are some quarters where it's been up to about 15%. So comfortably over 10%. And sometimes it does spike to about 15%. So again, the more biofuels that are incorporated, the lower the carbon intensities and more fossil fuels that are displaced. And in addition, just kind of like a note about the electricity, in our program, if you have a personal electric vehicle, it's, you know, so I own a Leaf, I don't get my own credits, but my utility gets my credits. And the credits that go to the utilities, then they sell the credits and they fund programs that support transportation electrification. And so over the past 7 years too, there's about $50 million in EV projects that have been funded through this revenue through the utilities.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, you asked earlier about the credit market. So this is a graph about what it looks like our credit market has looked like since 2016. So the blue bars are the volumes of credits that have been traded. And the green line is basically the credit prices. And so you can see like early on, you know, it started off like probably about, I think the first trade was $70 or something like that. It has, we don't set the price for the credits, the market sets the price. What we do is actually, since all of the transactions for the sales of the credits come through our system, so we know who's trading who, how many credits at one price. And so then we publish that on a monthly basis on our website to provide transparency to the market. You can see that, you know, like in 2019, it peaked, I want to say probably about $163 per ton of emissions is what we peaked at. And then you can see it come down. And basically for the past 2 whole years through 2021 and 2022, it's really been in this $100, $110, $120 range. It's been really steady. And so, you know, that's, I mean, for us, that's a good sign. If you see this chart for the state of California, it's kind of all over the place. They have gone all the way up in excess of $200. Right now, they're at 65, I want to say. right? So the credit price in Oregon is actually stronger than what is in California right now. So, and what that means is that, if you're a biofuel producer and you're trying to decide where you want to take your fuel, you're going to try and maximize that revenue. So you're going to go for the highest credit prices. In 2022, when you add up all the credit transactions, there was about $185 million that have passed through the program.
Do you have just briefly, you have any thoughts on why the Oregon price has been steadier than the California price?
Yeah, I think the easiest explanation is, this is all about supply and demand. And so it's how many credits are in the market and what the stringency of the targets are, right? So if the targets are easy to meet, and then there's a lot of credits, and that's what forces the credit prices to go down. California has been, a couple of really good things have happened. They have a lot of renewable natural gas that, as you noticed in the previous slide, really low carbon intensities. They have a lot of renewable diesel. I think 40% of their diesel fuel right now is renewable diesel. So that is a lot of credits. And they also, lead the country in EV adoption. And the electricity provided is also very low carbon. So there's a lot of credits in their market right now. And they haven't moved forward with adjusting the targets to make it more stringent. So in California, they've been actually going through their scoping plan process that you're familiar with, it's setting out targets out to 2035, 2045, 2050, that kind of thing. And so the individual programs that kind of live in that scoping plan have had to kind of wait to see what the big picture plan is before the programs do their rulemakings. So that scoping plan process for California just ended at the end of 2022. So the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program is basically starting their rulemaking in 2023, to increase their targets. So that's the thing, is that they're going to be looking out for much more aggressive targets. And so that will drive up the demand for credits, and that should stabilize their credit prices.
Okay. So is that part of the reason that you all have already projected all the way out to that 37% reduction level so people can see where you're going?
Yep, that's absolutely. We want to provide that certainty that the market is going to be there and what the stringency is, so that the fuel producers can, adjust and plan for that. Because these kinds of projects don't happen overnight. It's big capital projects, and transitioning from fossil to renewable, it takes a lot of capital and just a lot of time and permitting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what I'll go to next here is a slide where it's the impact of those credit prices on different fuels. Okay, so this $119 is what the average credit price was in 2022. And so if you have a fuel that is higher carbon, right? So if you have an E10 or B5, and those currently generate deficits in the program. So if you don't change that at all, you have to buy credits to offset your deficits. And you buy the credits, and so that translates into about 6.9 cents per gallon for gasoline and 7.9 cents per gallon for diesel. So diesel is a little dirtier, so which is why it costs a little bit more. But that's for if you do nothing different, right? And the whole purpose of this program is to change your choices as far as transportation fuels. So the ones that are underneath that, you see the prices are negative. That means they generate credits, and then you sell those credits at $119 a ton, and it provides revenue. And those revenue, if passed on to the cost of the fuels, is what the amount in the right column indicates. So even if you're saying you go from you're a truck driver and you have a B5 now, but you go and you fill up for B20, right? So 20% biodiesel instead of 5% biodiesel. It's the biodiesel that generates those credits. So B20 is about 1.8 cents per gallon, just cheaper than B5. So what we see too is if you go to the truck stops, people that are just buying on the price of the fuel, right? They'll buy the cheaper product. It works in their trucks fine. And that is what is driving the demand for more B20, more biodiesel blending in with the fuels. If you went to like, and what I put in the next 3 rows too is just examples of the credit generation potential of these biofuels. So, you know, a traditional biodiesel is either made with, in Oregon, most of it is made from canola, but, you know, soybean as well. It's about the same carbon intensity. So the scores are about 55, you know, so this one says 57. And so per gallon, that gallon of canola biodiesel is generating 54 cents per gallon in credit revenue. And if you go something like a used cooking oil biodiesel, right, their carbon scores, because it's a waste product as opposed to virgin oil, you know, so the carbon intensity of 18 is super low. So that's why you're generating $1.14 per gallon in credits. Renewable diesel has become wildly popular across the country and actually globally. And so we have a pathway that comes to Oregon where it is renewable diesel made from tallow, right? Taking from like, you know, animal fats. And that has a score of about 30. And so there you have almost $1 per gallon in credits, right? That are associated with this fuel. So if you're trying to sell that product, you know, and if you're passing down those cost savings to the end users who are actually putting them into vehicles, then this is how it actually brings down the cost of those fuels. And I wanted to add, you know, in the last 2 rows, I did put some electric vehicle information in there because that the, you know, the electricity market is electric vehicles are just becoming so popular now. And so the carbon intensity of the electricity for Oregon, at least, and this is just a statewide grid mix, we have a lot of utilities that are on Bonneville Power hydro electricity. And so that's like practically 0 carbon. But for just, if you take the statewide grid and the mix of what we're importing, we do have still a bunch of coal and natural gas in our mix. So our carbon intensity for our electricity is about 40. And so, but what that results in is like for a light duty vehicle, passenger vehicle, it's generating about 7.6 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you're putting that electricity into a heavy duty vehicle like a bus, it's more like 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So in Oregon, the average electricity wholesale prices are about in the 9-cent range, 9 cents per kilowatt hours. So the credits from these, from CFP actually a lot of times offset just the cost of paying for that electricity for that fleet. And so there is a lot of upfront capital costs. You have to buy the vehicles, you have to buy the chargers, but moving in, you know, in the future with grant opportunities and rebates and what have you, you know, the clean fuels credits have become pretty important as far as kind of like how you stack and create like, you know, your funding, your return on investment for a project. And so it's become, it gets its own slice of the pie when you do that.
Great, thank you. We have a question here.
So I have a couple of questions here. So one, I'm curious if your credit is pegged to an amount of carbon. Is it like pegged to like a value of like tons of carbon or something, or is it pegged to like $1 spent, or like how are you defining like the smallest increment of a credit?
Yeah, so our credit is actually defined in statute as 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas reductions.
Okay, and thank you, that's good to know. Second thing is, I noted that you a little bit quickly mentioned that for your leaf, you don't get to keep the credits, the utility gets to keep the credits. Is that also in statute, or how is it that you as the owner, or one as the owner of the leaf, don't get a say in that?
Yeah, so that wasn't in statute. We did that in the regulation. So when we were just for all of these different fuels, basically, we went and in the regulation, we designate who is eligible to generate that credit. So for mostly when you're talking about electric vehicles, it's usually the owner of the charger that generates the credit. So if you have public charging, if you have transit agencies, if you have fleets, other fleets, workplaces, those kinds of things, multi-unit dwellings, apartments. So whoever owns the charger can generate those credits. But on the residential side, right, like Oregon's got 60,000 EVs now, and I'm not writing checks to every EV owner. And so what it was negotiated was that to roll those credits up to our utilities. So basically every 6 months, I get EV registration data from our DMV, and we map all of those vehicles to a utility service area. And then the utility gets the credits of all of the vehicles that are in their territories. We have 3 big investor-owned utilities that are regulated by our PUC. So the revenue and then the spending of that revenue comes under the purview of an oversight of PUC with stakeholder involvement about how to use those funds. We also have about 3 dozen consumer-owned utilities, co-ops, municipals, public utility districts, and the spending of that is left to their governing boards. Our regulation doesn't dictate how to spend it, but with the PUC oversight, it is that revenue has to be broadly returned to support transportation electrification, statewide education and outreach, some innovative projects like vehicle-to-grid projects or light pole projects. The vast majority of it, about 70% of that money has been turned into grants to community-based organizations. So workforce training, infrastructure in rural parts of the state, partnerships with agencies that provide medical assistance, Meals on Wheels, a lot of really, really good community-based programs that want to get into more electrification or convert their fleets, to electric versions instead of gas versions.
And sorry, one more question for you. Just knowing that biodiesel is, and this is kind of a chemistry question, I guess, like is just more of a, I'm not sure if the right word is surfactant, but just the thinking about how it's, thinking about the transition for folks. Have there been hiccups along the way in terms of the equipment with things getting clogged or issues with the temperature, in the cold?
Yeah, absolutely. So what it is with the biodiesel, it is a chemistry question. It is a methyl fatty acid methyl ester. So it's the way that it's made, so that you have to blend it into the biodiesel. Most of the truck manufacturers do warranty up to a 20% blend for biodiesel into fossil diesel. And so the truck engines perform fine at that blend levels. In the winter, when it gets really, really cold, there have been some gelling issues. And so our regs, actually, it's not even our regs, it's our weights and measures that have our fuel quality standards allow for some additional kerosene to be put in to just be able to address the cold issues. So that's on, and that's kind of on the biodiesel side. There are technologies that you can retrofit your truck with that you can actually use up to a B100, like 100% biodiesel. So there are fleets that do that as well. And that is to just distinguish the biodiesel from the renewable diesel, right? So renewable diesel is actually made at a refinery. So it's a regular diesel refinery, it's a hydrocracker, and you just put the renewable feedstock into it. So what comes out the end meets the standard ASTM standard for diesel. So then if you have renewable diesel, you can replace your 100% diesel with renewable diesel with no additional additives or anything like that, or performance issues. This actually runs cleaner. There's reductions in particulate and soot. And it's just it has a higher cetane than regular diesel, so it actually performs better for the engines.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Okay, I've got one more slide. So, and so this is what I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. So the Oregon program, so initially when we started in 2016, we had rules that basically set out a 10% reduction out to 2025. So it was a 10-year period. And that's how we started our program. And so last year in 2022, we decided to expand the program. We did want to provide certainty out into 2035. And so we went through a year-long rulemaking. It was intense. We basically opened up the entire regulation and updated things. So the biggest thing that we did was we expanded the target. So out in 2030, it's to achieve 20% reductions, and out to 2035, it's to achieve 37% reductions. And you're going to say 37 is a really weird number, and it is kind of a weird number. But what happened is that we hired consultants to help us kind of look at what the vision of 2035 might be for both vehicles and fuels available. And then we said, you know, Oregon is a 177 state. So we had already adopted advanced clean trucks. We knew we were going to adopt advanced clean cars. So we loaded that into our vision of, you know, 2035. We also wanted to continue to support liquid biofuels. Even if electrification is the long-term plan, there will be many, many years where liquid biofuels and internal combustion engines are still going to be around. So we wanted to make sure that those liquid fuels continued to get cleaner and cleaner. So when we threw this all into the model, the number that kind of popped out is they thought that 37% carbon intensity reductions is what was needed as targets to continue to incent the kinds of things that we wanted to see in the future. And so 37% is life cycle emissions again. But what that translates into tailpipe, it's about 48% reductions in tailpipe greenhouse gases, which, I mean, coincidentally, and everybody says that it's not coincidence, right? So the state of Oregon has interim greenhouse gas reduction goals of 50% in 2035. So this tailpipe 48% kind of gives us just right into the ballpark of like what the contribution for transportation emission reductions needs to be. What that also does is that when we did this analysis, we also partnered with UC Davis and translated what those greenhouse gas reductions would mean as far as criteria pollutant reductions. So primarily reductions in PM from, you know, burning renewable fuels or the electricity fuels, the zero tailpipe emissions technologies versus gas and diesel. And that then translates into about $90 million per year in avoided health costs, right? So and most importantly here too, it is very much top of mind for environmental justice and equity issues, because as you all know, the highest impacted communities, the overburdened communities, are the ones that live closest to the transportation corridors. So any reductions in the mobile source emissions really benefits those communities. So that's what we've done. So we've started this year out and with our new standards, and gotten a lot of positive feedback from the industry for going out to 37% and going out to 2035. Our environmental community and our public health community, again, also very much are happy that we are, having these local impacts benefits in the state as well. So that's all I have.
Okay, a quick question on the difference between 48 and 37. So is the 9% difference, that's emissions related to the full pathway? That's why there's a higher.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're adding that back in.
Right. I mean, the difference in the life cycle would be, like if the refinery that's making these biofuels are out of state, right? So then you'll see some emissions at that refinery in another state, or in the extraction or in the production of the feedstocks or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Sarah White.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. Thank you so much, Corianne, for coming and talking to us. We've heard a lot about the Oregon model, and it's really important, I think, for us to get it right from folks who have implemented the program. So I just have a few questions just to seek out some truth around some commentary we had from the administration in relation to the work that you've done in Oregon. One of the concerns we heard from the administration is we're considering a clean fuel, a clean thermal related standard in Vermont. We're calling the Affordable Heat Act. One of the concerns that was raised was that we don't have enough fossil fuel data, or we don't have enough tracked fuel data to actually implement a program like this. And one of the comments that was made that in Oregon, you also felt that way when you launched your program. I'm wondering if you could tell us if that does jive with how you felt as Oregon was opening the program, and what was the ultimate result, knowing that you have now a very healthy and successful program.
I would agree. You know, back in 2010, when we started working with the stakeholders on this, I mean, I would say that the best data that we had in state for transportation fuels came from our fuel tax data, right? The collection of the fuel taxes and just what, the amount of gas and diesel were coming into the state. So it was a lot of work to partner with the fuel providers to be able to work with them and identify the different ways for them to keep track, because now this is not just gas and diesel, right? It is all of the biofuels. And so keeping track of the ethanols, the biodiesels, the renewable diesels have been, it's complicated. And like I said, there's not just one ethanol and one biodiesel, right? There's a lot, dozens are being used depending on who's buying from who. So it did take a while. There was actually in Oregon at the beginning of the program, there was kind of a pause as far as implementation. Our statute first passed in 2009, and we didn't start implementing in 2016. Part of that is because of recession. Part of that is because of a sunset clause that was in our original bill. But we took that time to develop our web reporting system, our IT system. We took that time to work with our stakeholders to identify the different ways in the systems that would take for them to actually keep track. And so I thought it was really time well spent to do that homework so that when it was time to implement, all of that was in place.
Thank you. That's really helpful information. I think what I'm hearing is that you might not have had as much data as you would have liked, but you were able to stand up a program, and that a pause to be able to develop the right systems was needed. And I think that is what we see in our bill as well. So the other question I had was, we've had it brought to our attention that the GREET model is not a one size fits all, and that you'd have to adapt it to an individual state. And we've heard that as a reason to not move forward with this bill. I'm wondering if you could speak to how Oregon was able to customize the GREET model to reflect your state, and if you feel that it clearly wasn't an insurmountable challenge. I'm wondering if you could speak to how you might see another state doing the same.
That's actually a great question. So in theory, you could take the base model, GREET model that is developed by Argonne National Laboratory. You could just use that. A lot of what Oregon did was to align with what California was doing and just to make the process more efficient. So California had actually gone ahead and starting in 2010, right? So they took GREET and they adjusted it for California. And so we didn't adjust from the base GREET, we adjusted from CalGREET.
Oh.
And so then our differences are pretty small. We're talking about, defining our electricity grid mix, maybe more, better. And so say X company in Iowa is taking fuel to California, and they've already got a CalGREET model. They want to take that same product to Oregon. they can actually take that same CalGREAT model and just change like the transportation distance, right? Because that's one of the factors in there. So it's going to Oregon instead of California. They'll change that, and then they just basically send that to us, right? And so it's a really more efficient process of doing that. So, but it is that alignment with CalGREAT and then ORGREAT, and then now WaGREAT, Washington, has done the same thing as well. So that's the thing. So you could go with this national GREAT model, or you could customize it, but I would then recommend, customizing it off the CalGREAT model.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting information.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the tour and the answering our questions. I think if we have more questions, can we get back in touch to follow up, maybe by email or just a quick conversation via the web again?
Yep, absolutely, anytime.
Okay, so thanks so much. Good to see you again, and it's great to see that your program's doing so well.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. With that, we are going to pivot to hearing from Mr. Duval, who has done some more analysis on testimony we've taken. So, Mr. Duval, please rise to the table. Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Chair Bray, members of the committee. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to join you. For the record, my name is Jared Duval. I'm testifying today in my capacity as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, to which I was appointed to provide expertise in energy and data analysis. On the council, I serve as co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee and as a member of the Cross-Sector Mitigation and Steering Committees. If it's okay, I would like to request that the committee hold questions until the end of testimony, just so I can be sure to share that full testimony. In the allotted time that I have, it's going to be tight. If there are additional questions, I'm happy to stay longer, happy to come back, but just want to forewarn you that I think it's going to take the full time.
We'll strap in and let's go.
So I would like to respond to testimony that you heard last week from Secretary Moore. Up front, I want to be clear that the Secretary was not presenting analysis that was commissioned by or reviewed by the Climate Council. The independent professional analysis that has been commissioned by the Council and by the Agency of Natural Resources, specifically the Marginal Abatement Cost Curves report, shows what I shared with you in my previous testimony: an expected net lifetime savings of $2 billion, or $7,500 per household on average, as a result of actions taken between now and 2030 to meet the pollution reduction targets in the thermal sector, which is what the Affordable Heat Act is designed to do. That $2 billion net lifetime savings does not include an additional estimated $3 billion in avoided economic damages calculated using the social cost of carbon adopted by the Vermont Climate Council and the state of New York, which brings the total to $5 billion in economic savings and avoided damages. Unlike the Marginal Abatement Cost Curves report, the Secretary's self-described back of the envelope analysis was never shared with the Climate Council, nor was it ever reviewed by the Science and Data Subcommittee of the Council, which I co-chair. Why the administration felt the need to ignore the commissioned analysis and rush out different analysis that had not been fact-checked or carefully reviewed is not clear to me. I am especially concerned because upon just an initial review, I and other independent analysts have found the Secretary's analysis to contain many errors and omissions, leading it to be both deeply flawed and grossly inaccurate. Before I go farther, I want to share my belief about the responsibility that policy analysts and modelers have. Much of this belief was formed during my training in public policy analysis, including graduate courses in economics and the ethics of public policy as part of my Master of Public Affairs program. It was further developed during the time that I served in state government at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and also over the last 6 years where I've conducted energy and economic analysis while leading the independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization Energy Action Network. It's also been developed over the last 2.5 years while serving on the Vermont Climate Council as the counselor appointed to provide expertise in energy and data analysis. I believe that the job of policy analysts is to inform decision makers and illuminate policy issues to the best of our ability, drawing on the most up-to-date, accurate, and complete data information at hand. It is to present that information as fully and honestly as possible, regardless of whose position it supports, and to do so both carefully and with humility. When I first came to testify to this committee on the Affordable Heat Act, Chair Bray asked me to share what the net costs or net savings would be for meeting the thermal sector greenhouse gas reduction requirements by 2030, which is what the clean heat standard that the Affordable Heat Act would establish is initially designed to do. Again, that is a question that has been answered in a report to the Climate Council commissioned by the Agency of Natural Resources, known as the Marginal Abatement Cost Curves Report. The report estimated that all the modeled thermal sector emissions reduction activity between now and 2030 would lead to about $3 billion in lifetime savings from measures that generate net savings, while resulting in about $1 billion in lifetime costs from measures that generate net costs. I shared the end result of that equation, about $2 billion in net lifetime savings as a result of all the modeled thermal sector emissions reduction measures between now and 2030. One point, the presentation of costs that you heard last week from Secretary Moore was not a presentation of net costs. The Secretary framed part of her testimony by saying, a number of witnesses have spoken about the benefits, and then went on to say, but the upfront costs are also real. To the extent that the Secretary may have been referring to my testimony, her statement would be fair if I had only focused on the savings, but I did not. I presented the net savings after accounting for costs. Specifically, I presented the answer that independent analysis generated for the Agency of Natural Resources and the Climate Council about $2 billion in net lifetime savings, an average of $7,500 per household as a result of actions taken between now and 2030. In contrast, the Secretary presented you with a figure that focused entirely on costs and did not account for either savings or the difference between costs and savings or net savings. Here I would just briefly like to note that an approach that focuses only on upfront costs and not on benefits or savings would lead us to make very poor decisions in our daily lives, such as never going to the doctor because it costs something upfront, or not weatherizing your home to achieve dollar savings and improve health because it costs something upfront. The biggest error that was identified fairly quickly in the review of the analysis is that the analysis presented last week only gives long-lived measure investments a tiny fraction of their value and assumes that they would be expensed upfront rather than amortized over their full lifespan, thus inflating the price effect by 10 to 14 times. Given the 2025, 2030, and 2050 requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Clean Heat Standard is designed to exist until at least 2050, perhaps beyond. The analysis shared by Secretary Moore was cut off at 2030. However, installed measures like heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, and weatherization all have measure lives that will result in both bill savings for customers and the generation of clean heat credits that will be bought by obligated parties, i.e. they will generate economic value for anywhere from 13 to 25 years. So from 2026 to 2038, or from 2026 to 2050. Not just for 1 to 5 years, i.e. the 2026 to 2030 period that Secretary Moore's analysis focused on. Specifically, in the technical resource manual that Vermont uses to characterize the lifespans of these measures for efficiency for Tier 3, the estimates are 13 years for heat pump water heaters, 15-year life for heat pumps, and 25-year life of the measure for weatherization. When you have something of economic value that has a long life, the correct way to account for it as a business, which all obligated parties are, is via amortization of costs over the life of the investment, not incurring and expensing all of that cost in just 1 year. Because clean heat credits generated from the installed measures and purchased by obligated parties will generate economic value for obligated parties for 13 to 25 years, the obligated parties who use business accounting will amortize their costs to acquire those multi-year credits for their respective 13 to 24-year time periods, not incur and expense them all up front. Another way to say this is that an obligated party who incentivizes a customer to install a heat pump in 2026 would recover the cost of that incentive not just in 2026, and not just from 2026 through 2030, but from 2026 through 2040. This leads to the first major problem with Secretary Moore's analysis. She assumed that if a fuel importer who is an obligated party provides an incentive for a customer to install a heat pump, that the obligated party would then seek to recover the entire incentive amount in the year it is spent. But remember, a heat pump installation doesn't just reduce emissions in the year it is installed. It also reduces them for the next 14 years as well. Thus, it reduces the obligated parties, the fuel importers' cost of complying with the Affordable Heat Act, not just for 1 year, but for 15 years. As a result, obligated parties would amortize or finance that cost over 15 years, not just over 1 year. This is the same thing that utilities do when they make an investment in a new power plant, a new electric substation upgrade, or a new part of the gas distribution system. And obligated parties who don't want to amortize investments in a multi-year clean heat measures can also assign their obligation to the default delivery agent, sell 1-year measures such as biofuels, or simply purchase 1 year's worth of clean heat credits from an installer. All ways that they will be able to pay for only a single year's worth of their obligation in each year, not 13 to 25 years in 1 year. By assuming that fuel dealers and other obligated parties would fully recover the lifetime cost of measures that produce clean heat credits for decades in just 1 year, Secretary Moore's analysis significantly overstated the near-term impact on prices for fuel oil and propane. After accounting for a discount rate, the overstatement is probably a factor of roughly 10 to 14 in the first year of the policy. And while there would likely continue to be additional increases over the years as emissions go down, even by 2030, they would be significantly less than the numbers cited by Secretary Moore. The Secretary suggested that her analysis may be off by a factor of 2. By not valuing the full life of the measures and not using amortization schedules as is appropriate for the business accounting that obligated parties would use and the options available to them, her analysis is already off by more like a factor of about 10 to 14 in the initial years of the policy. The analysis that the Secretary presented assumes that all Vermont residents would have to be provided with incentives covering 90% of the upfront cost to be motivated to do things like weatherize homes and install heat pumps and heat pump water heaters that often already save money over time without providing any incentive or just a very low incentive toward the cost of installation. This 90% assumption is unreasonably high. Combined with the previously discussed error, it leads the Secretary's estimate to be perhaps 20 to 28 times too high in the initial year of the policy. The assumption of needing to pay 90% or more of an incentive may be true for low-income Vermonters who don't have savings or easy access to capital and often do need 100% of the cost covered, often via grants, and doing so is very important for equity reasons. However, even for low-income customers, it may not always be necessary to pay 100% incentives if there are alternate options for financing investments over time in ways that still result in savings. For example, VGS has a heat pump water heater leasing program that eliminates the upfront cost barrier. This committee has heard testimony about the Weatherization Repayment Assistance Program, another model that addresses the upfront cost barrier. Either way, lower income Vermonters are anticipated to generate only about 16% of the emissions reduction resulting from the clean heat measures in the overall program, or about 30% of the emissions reduction in the residential market. Extrapolating an assumption that's appropriate for lower income Vermonters to all customers is inappropriate. Assuming that incentives covering 90% of the cost will be necessary to entice all customer groups to take actions that are in their economic interest, absent any or very little extra incentive, is far too high. The Secretary cited Efficiency Vermont's incentives in her testimony. My understanding is that most of the incentives available from Efficiency Vermont, often complemented with electric utility incentives, are usually less than 30% of project costs when including the electric utility additions. The only case of a 75% incentive that I am aware of is the weatherization incentive for low-income households, and even that is capped at $5,000, which will leave many low-income homeowners with a larger necessary investment to complete their projects, since the average weatherization project is higher than $6,666. For heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, and advanced wood heat, the incentives are less than 30%. To assume that higher incentives than these will be necessary to generate additional installations is very reasonable. To assume that all this activity would require incentives 3 times higher than the current incentive rates at 90% is not reasonable. That leads to another point. Secretary Moore's analysis seems to ignore all of the activity that is already occurring. Specifically, based on state and Efficiency Vermont data over the past few years, that includes nearly 3,000 weatherization projects per year, about 10,000 heat pumps a year, and about 2,000 heat pump water heaters a year. While much of this activity is happening with some form of incentive, often through weatherization assistance or Tier 3, all of this activity is already happening without any extra incentive provided by fossil fuel companies in the form of clean heat credit payments. And all of that will count towards clean heat standard compliance. And much of this activity will also happen just as a matter of course. Take the example of heat pump water heaters. If your water heater dies and you need to replace it, would most Vermonters expect to pay only 10% of the cost, when in the absence of the incentive, they would likely be paying 100% of the cost of a new water heater? For many of these measures, there is an important difference between modeling the incremental cost, i.e. compared to the alternative option, versus the full upfront cost of the equipment. Secretary Moore's analysis made the mistake of assuming that the Affordable Heat Act will impose the full cost of new equipment on the market, rather than the incremental cost difference between an electric heat pump water heater and a new propane model, for instance. In other words, not only was the 90% average incentive assumption problematic, but her analysis incorrectly assumed it would always be applied to the full cost of the new equipment rather than the incremental cost. Here I want to note, to be fair, this critique would only apply in the case of where new equipment for which there is a low carbon alternative. For weatherization, it's always the full cost that is an issue. If the 90% incentive assumption is too high by at least a factor of 2, which seems plausible upon initial review, then in addition to the failure to account for the full value of long-lived measures and to properly amortize their investment costs, that would bring the overall possible magnitude of error in the Secretary's calculations to a factor of 20 to 28. Stated differently, the estimated price increase that she said fossil fuel users might expect in 2026, and then on an annual basis going forward, is perhaps 20 to 28 times too high or more. There are other problems with this analysis as well. It did not account for the expected price declines per unit for heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, etc., as we benefit from economies of scale. Several years ago, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory released a report that, among other things, forecasted how heat pumps are expected to decline in the future. The cost of them is expected to decline in the future as electrification advances. This pace of decline is likely to accelerate even faster given the recent passage of the IRA. I included in my testimony a graphic that illustrates their conclusion about those anticipated price declines. The Secretary's analysis also appears to assume that upfront costs would only be spread across fuel oil and propane sales, which together totaled about 250 million gallons in Vermont in 2019. This leaves out pipeline gas, which represented an additional 24% of thermal fuel sector sales in Vermont in 2019. While the Secretary's analysis attempted to account for federal incentives, it appears that it did not account for state-level programs that are already delivering emissions reductions in the thermal sector that would also count toward umbrella clean heat standard compliance, including the Weatherization Assistance Program and other state-funded weatherization program and Tier 3 programs. Yes, fossil fuel companies will have to pay service providers to acquire those credits, but again, not anywhere near 90% of the total cost. Not to mention other voluntary actions being taken by Vermonters without existing incentives. The Secretary's testimony talked about upfront costs. What I think are better understood as upfront investments, especially as they will be spread out over time by obligated parties, but did not speak about them relative to the cost of another policy that could achieve the same emissions reduction outcome. The administration has not suggested another thermal sector policy to replace a clean heat standard. We cannot compare the upfront cost of this policy to the upfront cost of doing nothing, both because A, inaction does not allow us to achieve the customer savings over time from reducing dependence on fossil fuel, and B, legally speaking, doing nothing is not an option, given that we are legally obligated to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act. But focusing just on the first three major errors in the analysis last week that I covered earlier in testimony makes the main point I want to share with you today. These are complex issues that deserve careful analysis. The kind of analysis the PUC is best suited to do through expert analysis and the rulemaking process. And if the concern is price impacts on fossil fuels, it should also be noted that there are cost control guardrails already in the bill that are designed to address that. Subsection 8124A4. I respect Secretary Moore. I know her to be a dedicated public servant. However, because I respect her and you, I have to say what she presented to you last week was inappropriately selective, improperly done, and deeply misleading. She testified that she was confident she was wrong. I am also confident that she was wrong, very wrong. The question she was trying to answer, the price effect of a policy on the price per gallon of a fuel, is nearly impossible to answer until the rules have been finalized and the market has actually been created. This modeling challenge involves a multitude of variables, assumptions, and interactive effects. A confident, responsible answer to that question simply cannot be generated in a back-of-the-envelope manner. I'm not here to offer an alternative number to Secretary Moore's analysis. While I am confident that her analysis vastly exaggerates the price effect on fossil fuels, to be more precise about what a more appropriate number might be would take building a sophisticated model that better accounts for the nuance and complexity I referred to. And again, that is the careful analysis that I expect will take place in the PUC process and then be reviewed by the legislature, given how S5 is written. For now, the only actual economic estimate we have from independent experts who are hired by the Secretary's own agency, is that the Affordable Heat Act, if it reduces thermal sector emissions as envisioned in the Climate Action Plan, could save Vermonters a net total of $2 billion or $7,500 per household, just as a result of the activity between now and 2030. You just heard, I only have one more page of notes, if it's okay.
We are over, if you could really wrap up.
Okay, I will go quickly. We just heard about the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, and that is a place that we can draw on real-world evidence from the closest example to this policy in another state, which is Oregon's Clean Fuel Standard, a performance standard for fossil fuel importers, just like the Affordable Heat Act. What Oregon found was that for every 5% reduction in carbon pollution achieved, it resulted in about a 1% increase in the price of fossil fuels, 1%. At the same time, and this is very important, as you just heard from Corianne Wynn, the policy also resulted in decreases in the prices of the cleaner alternatives. So while their clean fuel standard, and the numbers I'm going to use are from 2021, I didn't have the 2022 numbers she just shared. While their data had a price effect of an additional 5 to 6 cents per gallon of fossil fuel in 2021, in that same year, it also brought down the price of biodiesel from used cooking oil by about $1.16 per gallon, and the price of biodiesel made from soybean oil by about 61 cents per gallon, making biodiesel less expensive than diesel. And that's part of the intent of a clean heat standard. It's not to get people to pay more. It's to help people pay less, saving on energy costs that have been far too high for far too long because of fossil fuel dependence. For instance, fuel oil customers who currently use fuel oil and who want to save money, as a result of this program, they will be able to use biodiesel instead thereby lowering their heating costs. If the price of B100 biodiesel from used cooking oil or from a standard soybean biodiesel is reduced by as much in Vermont as we saw in Oregon. We should also reasonably expect the price of electricity to decline in Vermont in the near to medium term as a result of the electrification that the Affordable Heat Act will help advance, as fixed utility costs get spread over a broader base of use. This would help offset any price increase on fossil fuels. And since all Vermonters use electricity, or nearly all, we would all realize that benefit, whereas not all Vermonters use fossil heating. And of course, a clean heat standard would be especially important in its ability to make weatherization heat pumps and heat pump water heaters more affordable and more accessible, giving many more options to help people escape from fuel prices that are by their very nature high cost and price volatile. Overall, this policy is designed to achieve massive net savings in energy costs alongside legally required pollution reduction. In conclusion, I want to reiterate my belief that it is irresponsible and misleading to selectively present upfront costs as though they are the whole story, and then to ignore the expected savings on both sides of the economic modeling equation. It is also irresponsible and misleading to present vastly exaggerated price effects on fossil fuels, and to do so without also communicating estimated price effects in the opposite direction on the cleaner alternatives, from biodiesel to electricity, which are expected to drop in price while becoming more accessible as a result of the Affordable Heat Act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. We are about to adjourn. I just do want to note for the record that I'm a little uncomfortable with characterizing anyone else's testimony as irresponsible. That said, every witness is free to bring their own testimony forward. With that, thank you, committee, for staying over.